So when Games Workshop releases a new edition of Warhammer 40k, it's almost guaranteed to come with a massive release for the Space Marines. It looks like this edition's going to be very similar. It's Space Marines versus Tyranids as the antagonist and protagonist factions, I guess you choose which, and they're both going to be getting enormous plastic model releases to usher in the new edition, and Games Workshop has shown a whole ton of them off already. Last time Games Workshop had a new edition of the game, the cinematic trailer where we saw the Space Marines versus the Necrons had a whole ton of new units from the Indomitors box set, including some very specific characters that they could field, and some all-new units for both sides shown off, including things like that Necron Scorpec Lord. I'm absolutely certain that everything that was in their cinematic reveal trailer will be getting a new miniature. That's what they've done in the past. So let's talk through each of the units in there one by one, now the dust has settled on the trailer. This video being very much guided by your comments in the last one. Thanks for spotting so much more than my initial reaction. So first up out of the gate is a Primaris squad armed entirely with flamers. We've had the Hellblasters armed with plasma, we've had the Eradicators armed with melter. It was kind of logical that flamers were next, and they certainly seem to be being put to good work here, burning down a whole bunch of Tyranid termagants and purging the little ones from the battlefield. We don't actually get to see that much of them in the cinematic, but it does appear that they are a different unit to the Primaris Veteran Squad, which we'll get onto in a second. There are shots of them kind of mixed together, but these ones definitely appear to be armed with Pyroblasters, whereas the Veterans appear to be armed with combi weapons. Looks like if you need a whole bunch of anti-infantry duty taken care of, then these Primaris Flamers will probably be able to sort that. I feel like in general though, if you're upgrading the damage potential of a squad, a lot of people tend to want things that can actually harm all sorts of things in the game, rather than just doubling down on extreme anti-infantry. Still though, the models look really quite cool. They're basically the same gun as we've seen here on the Black Templar Crusader squad. I think just about everyone was predicting that we'd get an entire squad of these at some stage. It seems like quite a big win for the Salamanders, to be honest, who will no longer be looking at their black armoured brethren with envy. I kind of wonder whether these guys would have a troops or elites battlefield role, if that distinction is even really a thing in 40k 10th edition. Given that we don't really seem to have any other particularly obvious troops roles in this entire section though, I wouldn't be too surprised if these guys wound up being troops. Let me know what you reckon down in the comments. Seems fun though, basically Space Marine Hellblasters, but change out the plasma for some flamer purging goodness. Next up we have the ones that we already know about, the Space Marine Terminators. Really cool to see Games Workshop kind of blurring the line between Firstborn and Primaris here, giving us upscaled Terminators, but basically with the entire look and feel of the standard guys. In their cinematic, we get treated to a teleport assault for the Terminators, before these brutal armoured elites spin up their assault cannon and cut a massive swathe through the Tyranid army. It's pretty brutal stuff, and I feel like that's about as good an advert as you can possibly get for the Terminators with the assault cannon. I think a lot of people are going to want to put that on the table. The Space Marine Terminators are the one unit for the Marines that Games Workshop have actually shown off and we know the new models for. Beyond what we've seen in these two previewed ones here, we don't really get all that many more details from the trailer. It does seem though that the Sergeant still seems to have a power sword, so they're keeping with their traditional loadouts for them. In general, the reaction for these models has been pretty stellar from the internet. It's basically the exact same Terminator model, but upscaled a bit, much thicker legs, arms and torso. But they have made some pretty decent adjustments to things like the posing and the proportions of the model. For the most part, people seem to have thought that that's pretty much for the better. They look a lot more like there could be an actual man inside there now, as opposed to perhaps some slightly unlikely angles on the arms and legs before. Maybe the biggest changes are to their weaponry. A pretty snazzy assault cannon and storm bolter there, with the barrels looking like they actually come pre-hollow rather than having to drill them out, and a fairly sleek, clean, uncluttered aesthetic. Plenty of places for either freehand or transfers on armor plates. It is pretty cool that they say that they can either be Primaris or Firstborn, kind of blurring the line between their two ranges. Moving on, and up next we appear to have a Primaris ranged veteran unit, kind of akin to a Primaris Sternguard veteran squad. They do appear in really quite a lot of this cinematic trailer. Here they're a bit more at ease, but they certainly put those combi weapons to good effect. We don't really see them very properly as an entire unit all put together though. The way that you can tell that they're veteran Space Marines is that they get white shoulder trim and helmets, plus in general the idea of combi weapons generally tend to be handed out to the Space Marine veterans. They basically seem to me to be the Primaris equivalent of Sternguard. Putting a few different bits of the trailer together, it looks like that sergeant that you can see in this picture has a combi melter. You can tell he's the sergeant due to the red helmet there. I think two more of the squad have combi flamers. It appears that one of them has a combi Grav, the guy who gets mauled by the Screamer Killer Carnifex, and then later in the trailer, as we'll take a look at in just a second, it looks like one of them also has a Hellstorm Heavy Bolter, the Heavy Bolter variant that's carried by the Heavy Intercessors. I kind of feel like these guys have a bit of a direct mirror with the Indomitus box here. In Indomitus, we got combat veterans in Blade Guard. It seems that in 10th edition, we've moved forward to ranged veterans and Stern Guard. I'm sure they'll have some sort of new Primaris name to keep them differentiated, but they very much feel like the same sort of look and feel. In terms of in-game power, I feel like a whole bunch of combi weapons could be a pretty interesting choice for putting in things like transports. If impulsors wind up being good in 10th edition, then these seem like a squad that could be good in there. Zoom them over, jump them out, and unload a whole bunch of snazzy combi weapon shots into the foe. Later in the trailer, we also get these images of a Hellstorm Heavy Bolter veteran. I was wondering if he might be a character in my first reaction video to it. A fair few of you guys pointed out things in the comments though. Looks like he's got a scoped eye, and the Heavy Bolter that he's got looks like it's basically akin to the ones that the Heavy Intercessors carry. It's even got the same slightly angled grip. Next up, and this will be quite a treat if it was indeed included in the launch box, is what appears to be a ranged Redemptor Dreadnought. I guess we've had the regular Redemptor with the fist and the big gun, the combat variant that is the Brutalis Dreadnought with his pair of talons and chest-mounted multi-melters. Now we've got the ranged version of him, equipped with a las cannon and missile launchers. In the cinematic, he makes really quite an entrance, stomping forward out of the mist and unleashing a volley of rockets to distract that Screamer Killer before finishing it off with a big burst of its las cannons. The Dreadnought really is a bigger, updated version of the old classic boxy Dreadnought. This guy with his twin las cannon and multi-shot missile launcher is a bit of an iconic sight. They have still kind of been borderline competitive for a fair bit of 8th and 9th, providing a little bit of long-range fire support and core in 9th. Given that it's basically the same armament but on a Redemptor chassis, I can't help but think that those las cannons are going to be extra potent. If we are going with the same damage system for 10th edition, I wouldn't be too surprised to see D3 plus 3 damage or something like that. Maybe those missiles will be something like Super Frag or Super Crack once more. Otherwise, on the Dreadnought, we've also got Storm Bolters on the Carapace. That's the same as the Redemptor there. Overall, it looks like he would be a long-range anti-tank gun turret, much like his forebear. Kind of fun now that we've got the combat one and the balanced one, and now we have the ranged one. Games Workshop's Dreadnought collection is complete for the Redemptor, perhaps. Next up, we perhaps have the viewpoint character on the ground, the Phobos Lieutenant. Besides Gilliman, this guy perhaps gets the most screen time out of all of the units in the trailer. He gets to cut down a whole bunch of Tyranids with his bolt rifle, and then there's this particularly brutal scene where he attacks a bunch of Tyranid Termagants and finishes one up with a pair of combat knives. It doesn't immediately look like he's part of any other unit in the trailer. I know he's got a combi weapon the same as the veterans, but the armour does look Phobos. It's got the sort of half-helm thing that they like on there, plus the slightly curved shoulder pad on the left-hand side. Given that he doesn't really look like he's with a squad, it kind of makes sense that he's a character, and he does look really quite similar to the current Phobos Lieutenant, the one that you can get in the Combat Patrol box. This guy also has fairly similar armament, a ranged weapon, and paired combat blades. Looks like the one in this trailer doesn't have the grav shoot or anything though, so perhaps no dropping in from the skies for him. Games Workshop really do seem to like their lieutenants, so it seems unlikely that they'll release a box without one of them in. I guess this would add an additional bit of war gear or two compared with the two that we have at the moment, the Phobos one and the Reaver one. I feel like maybe the best option, if they could stretch to it, would be a multi-part one that builds all of the previous options and means that you aren't just locked to individual monopose models. Knowing Games Workshop though, I'm a little bit skeptical about that. I'd guess that he'd be monopose if he is indeed in the starter box. In terms of in-game rules, I'm a bit skeptical as to whether he'd really add much. He doesn't have a snazzy close combat weapon like a power sword or power fist, doesn't have the durability of the Indomitus one with his storm shield. He is just going to be extra good at killing infantry with the combi flamer. I'd be kind of surprised if he was particularly good in-game when we get the rules for him, but I guess we'll wait and see on that front. Moving ever onwards, here we have the leader of the force, likely the leader of their launch box, a Terminator Captain, teleporting in from Deep Strike Assault. It's all very inspiring there, zapping down from a burst of blue light and then laying into the Tyranids with their storm bolters. In terms of what he's armed with, it looks like he's got a power sword, which I guess would be a master-crafted one, as it does look like he's a character. A storm bolter in his other hand doesn't appear to be any sort of combi weapon, and he does appear to be likely a character, as he's a fair bit more blingy than the other Terminators, At first glance I was a bit unsure as to whether or not he was the unit's sergeant, but it does look like the other Power Sword Terminator is on the right of him. Plus he's quite a lot more ornate with a white shoulder pad denoting his special status. As I said, I guess he'd be the leader of the launch box in a similar sort of way to the Indomitus Captain that we had in Ninth. I think it is pretty cool that Games Workshop is basically keeping all the Terminator characters on. I feel like the Firstborn have been gradually being wound down and retired, particularly their HQ line, so it's really quite nice to see something breathing life into their range once more. I feel like he's going to be a pretty cool miniature when we see him, going to be awesome upscaled to the same sort of level as the other Terminators. Then we've perhaps got one of the most unfortunate Space Marines in this entire preview with the Gravis Apothecary. Late at night, just trying to get a little bit of work done, and all of a sudden out of the infested forest out come the lictors, grab you from behind and throw you about a bit. To be fair to him, it's a pretty good example of Gravis armor protecting him, and I think it is pretty awesome that he's just blazing away at them with his bolt pistol, in spite of an attack that probably should have killed most people. This guy basically looks like he's the combination of the standard apothecary and a Primaris aggressor, basically. You can tell he's in Gravis armor by the armor cowling over his head there, though otherwise maybe doesn't look too dissimilar to the standard apothecary. The same sort of backpack mounted surgical tools plus his Redemptor bolt pistol. I guess in game if you want an apothecary but just that little bit tougher, this will probably be an option for that, likely going up to toughness 5 if they still have the same sort of stat lines in 10th. I'd guess that you'd probably have to pay a few more points for the privilege, but apothecaries are one of those units that often people like to snipe or take down, and the extra points as an insurance against that happening could well be worth it. I guess he's pretty pleased with his Gravis armor when he's ambushed by lictors, though I'm not 100% sure that it wound up actually saving him. Next up we have the rather snazzy runic armor of the Terminator Librarian. Seems as though, like the last couple of box sets for the launch of 8th and 9th, the box set here is going to be really quite character heavy, but also it does seem that Games Workshop are launching their new Terminator range in style. Again, another really quite fun one to see animated. I feel like psychic powers and warp magic are maybe one of the harder things to pull off in an animated trailer, though I feel like they made him pretty cool in this one. Again, didn't really have all the best time of it in the action and coming off second best to that Tyranid Psychic Abomination. This guy's got some slightly interesting choices for war gear, rather than the more typical one-handed force weapon plus storm bolter that Terminator characters often have. It looks like he's got a rather big two-handed force axe, and then to allow him to wield it, he's got a wrist-mounted storm bolter to go with it. Perhaps not so very different from those Grey Knights. Like previous Terminator Librarians, like this Blood Angels one that's still currently on sale, it's got a very similar psychic hood built into his Terminator armor, with the sort of cowling that looks a bit like Gravis armor, plus the cabling to either side of his chest feeding into it. Funnily enough, with a two-handed axe like this guy kinda reminds me a little bit of the Orc Mega Armored War Boss with his huge chopper. A big armored character coming back, but with a two-handed axe weapon as opposed to a choice of different things. I feel like there might be a bit of a danger of Terminator Librarians getting a bit mono loadout with his two-handed axe perhaps, though I guess they still do sell a few alternative ones, so maybe that's not founded. Still, I'm sure they'll be very big and imposing in new Terminator form. It'll be interesting to weigh up the relevance of psychic powers in 10th edition as well, now they've had some major changes being farmed out to different phases like the command one and the shooting phase. Lastly, and apologies for the dreadful picture here, we appear to possibly have a Primaris Ancient. He's on the hill raising the banner at the end, and we only sort of get a peripheral shot of him. If you look at this bit to the top right of the screen, then there he is as it zooms in on our Phobos Lieutenant once more. For this guy we can't really see all that many details for him. He seems to be fighting with a pistol here at the moment. It looks like he's just in the standard Mark 10 armor as opposed to anything more interesting. He might literally just be something very, very similar to the Dark Imperium one, or I guess he could be more similar to the recently released multi-part one. Seeing as he's barely seen in the trailer, I feel like he is probably the guy who's least likely to be in a launch box out of any of these. Still though, I'd probably say he's greater than a 50% chance. They've had an Ancient both in the Indomitus box and Dark Imperium before it. I feel like a nice Space Marine banner bearer is another cool focal point of a force, and maybe one that doesn't take up all that much space on a sprue, so it's usually going to be a win to them to put one in. I suppose if the last one that we had was a Blade Guard Ancient somehow, he could be in some way a new Primaris Ranged Veteran Ancient. That's just a complete guess though. So anyway, there we have it, a bit of a breakdown of all the Snazzy Space Marine goodness that was hiding in the launch trailer. My guess would be that these are probably the contents of the launch box and we'll get even more stuff besides this. It'd be really cool to see some things like Primaris Jump Infantry. maybe some neophytes, and I'm sure they could surprise us with more. If you spotted anything else in the trailer, feel free to let us know down in the comments. I'll be hoping to follow up this video with something similar for the Tyranids when I can get round to it. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k content coming. I'm sure I'll be having my work cut out with all the 10th edition news. If you'd like a bit more 10th edition analysis, I'll link my video about the 10th edition rules rollout down in the video description. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and the channel's Patreon is what allows me to keep on making videos like this quite so regularly. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.